Imagine you're sitting in a doctor's office. The healthcare provider walks in, checks your vitals, asks a few standard questions, scribbles notes, and prescribes medication. The entire interaction might feel rushed, personal, and mechanical. Now, think about an alternative. You walk in, the doctor sits down, makes eye contact, listens to your concerns deeply, and engages in a discussion where your values and preferences are at the heart of the decision-making process. This difference in experiences reflects the journey of the healthcare relationship, from the early days of paternalism, where the doctor was the ultimate authority, to the modern ideal of patient-centered care. In this lecture, we explore the transition of the health professional-patient relationship, tracing back to the sick role and paternalistic medical encounters through to modern models of active health consumers and clinical encounters. This area of study is important because for most people, the healthcare experience hinges on the relationship between the health professional and the patient and the clinical encounter where this relationship develops. Understanding the nature of interactions and the decision-making that occurs within consultations can help enhance relationships between healthcare providers and their patients and ultimately improve people's health and well-being. The starting point of research on the modern doctor-patient relationship can be traced back to sociologist Talcott Parsons' concept of the sick role. According to Parsons, doctors and patients fulfill a complementary role. The patient's role. The sick person was exempted from their normal social duties, according to Parsons. They were not held responsible for being ill. They were, however, expected to want to get better and to actively work towards regaining their health. And they were also expected to seek help from a qualified physician and cooperate fully with that person. The doctor, on the other hand, was tasked with using technical expertise to heal the patient, expected to act altruistically, putting the patient's health above personal interests, supposed to maintain professional detachment and objectivity. In return, the doctor was granted authority over the patient, including the right to examine her intimately and to prescribe treatment. So in this framework of the sick role, doctors were seen as highly competent, altruistic figures whose role was to restore health, often with considerable authority over patients. The clinical encounter was very one-sided, with the physician leading and the patient complying. Patients were largely passive recipients of care. During the later half of the 20th century, this traditional model faced numerous critiques. Firstly, the doctor-patient relationship is not always harmonious. For example, a patient seeking treatment for chronic pain might ask for more information about non-pharmaceutical treatments, but the doctor might push for conventional medication. In this instance, the patient feels unheard, and the gap between the patient and the healthcare provider's expectations widens. So this example shows how many patients may want more information than professionals want to give, or seek tailored care or alternative treatment, while the professional wants to manage the case in conventional and convenient ways, often because of the constraints of the practice, like short consultation times. Another critique was that medicine in the West is hierarchical and paternalistic, which calls into question Parsons' idea that the roles are complementary. And then finally, this model is really no longer relevant, especially in the 21st century, where we see an emphasis on healthy lifestyles that mean that everybody is personally responsible for her or his health. And this positions patients as potentially blameworthy for poor health. So rather than being excused from being ill, the patient would be held responsible. Looking to knowledge generated about the medical encounter from the late 20th century onward, we see that there are two main issues that are raised. First, the medical encounter is criticized as hierarchical, paternalistic, and excluding the patient's life world. Second, there is attention that's been drawn to power relations in this interaction that is rooted in social class, gender, and ethnic differences. Psychologist Elliot Mischler's groundbreaking qualitative analysis of doctor-patient interactions is relevant. His research showed how patients and physicians communicate with what he called two distinct voices in medical encounters. The first voice is the voice of medicine, and this consists of medical terminology with objective, supposedly, descriptions of physical symptoms and the categorization of these symptoms into a reductionist biomedical model. And that we will know from our previous module is about diagnosis. In contrast, the voice of the patients is characterized by non-technical language, expressing the subjective experience of what it is like to be sick. And this is told within the framework of social relationships and the patient's daily existence. Mischler's work showed that in most instances, medical professionals have greater power than patients in establishing the structure of the interaction. And this is largely related to their status as professionals, as experts who hold expert knowledge. But as we've highlighted in this course, illness and getting well is not just about the knowledge of the body, it is also about the social world and the information that the patient brings to the encounter is also useful and relevant. However, patients may experience their voices being overruled or shut down, and their individual meaning and social context as being wiped out of the clinical procedure in favor of a one-size-fits-all approach. So Mischler's work is important in that it highlighted the conflict between the voice of medicine, which focuses exclusively on the biomedically relevant details, versus the voice of the life world, which brings in the personal and social circumstances into the medical encounter. He showed how physicians maintain control of the clinical encounter, sometimes in unconscious ways, and really pointed to power imbalances within this relationship. Contemporary research continues to build on these important findings from Mischler's work, and much of this work tries to improve professional-patient relationships in order to ultimately improve healthcare and health outcomes. Very important work in this area has been done within feminist scholarship, which is very sensitized to the dimension of power. Feminist scholars in the 1970s and 80s brought attention particularly to gender dynamics and within those power imbalances that Mischler identified. And obviously, this was particularly between male doctors and female patients. They argued that medicine had long been a patriarchal institution where women especially were treated as passive, irrational, and dependent on male authority. Their research showed that medical encounters often reinforced sexist ideologies, positioning women as passive recipients of care, while doctors, again typically male, maintained dominance. By the 1990s, these critiques were expanded. So, in addition to looking at the gender relations, researchers also noted the intersections of ethnicity, class, and gender in the clinical encounter. So researchers found that middle class and white women received better care than working class and ethnic minority women. So as some examples, class and gender ideologies shaped the healthcare encounter in ways that middle class women were given permission to be ill in ways that working class women are not. And working class women overall received poorer quality medical consultation. Likewise, ethnic minority patients were often seen to be asked fewer questions by their doctor, so it was less of a conversation and less of eliciting the information from the patient. And they were also given less information about their condition and treatment. So it was a very top-down relationship. And obviously, this kind of interaction impacts on the health outcomes for the patients. So this later feminist work shows that there are multiple structural forces that intersect within the context of the clinical encounter. So by that, we are referring to things like sexism, ethnocentrism, racism, ageism, classism, and all the other isms. A recent example is US research with women of color and African American women who have polycystic ovary syndrome. This work shows that this group of women receives poorer care because of the intersection of gender and racial stereotypes within the clinical encounter. And really, these stereotypes are around weight bias, and weight gain is a prominent symptom of polycystic ovary syndrome. But women of color frequently report that during medical consultations, healthcare professionals assume that associated conditions like sleep apnea are just related to their being overweight, even sometimes when women are within a healthy weight range, and that their weight gain is caused by poor diet. But they don't look deeper to consider polycystic ovary syndrome as an underlying cause. So they don't look any further, and the condition goes untreated for a much longer period of time than for women from other groups. I mentioned that Parsons' sick role model no longer really fits the way that healthcare encounters look today. And from the late 20th century onwards, we see the medical encounter changing from the way that it was conceived in the 1950s by Parsons. And there were various societal changes that led to the reshaping of the doctor-patient relationship. And this means that that original paternalistic approach to medical relationships has begun to be replaced by new approaches to care and new models of clinical interactions. First, we look at the changing status of physicians. A rise of complementary and alternative medicine saw skepticism toward the scientific authority grow, and patients began to question the limits of biomedical approaches. And we see this, for example, in anti-vaccination movements. Incidents of medical malpractice and fraud also contributed to a decline in trust, showing that doctors are fallible, and increased patients' expectations for a cure, even when medicine obviously has limitations, also led to dissatisfaction with the traditional model. The reduced status of doctors makes it increasingly acceptable to actually dialogue with one's doctor, and in some cases, even for the patient to present a challenge. The second shift is the rise of medical consumerism or the consumer movement. Medical consumerism originated in radical health movements that emphasized dignity, empowerment, autonomy, access to information, and the patient's freedom to choose. So their main goal was to shift away from a paternalistic relationship of dependence on healthcare professionals. And to do this, they suggested that we should think of healthcare in terms of service provision, and that patients should be treated as independent, rational actors who exercise free choice, and doctors as service providers. And we hear that language in the way that we talk about healthcare today often. And this is largely because the movement was co-opted by neoliberalism. So in progressively more commercialized consumerist societies, we have seen an increasing corporatization of healthcare. One of the most stark examples of this is the USA, where there is no publicly funded healthcare and people have to pay for healthcare as a service, either through insurance or through their personal funds. So medical consumerism was replaced by this corporatization of healthcare, and healthcare became seen as a commodity. And what this meant on the plus side was that patients were increasingly seen not as passive recipients of care, but as autonomous, rational actors who access and often pay for healthcare as a service. So this means really that the protections that the person has is not about their healthcare rights as a human right so much, but more about consumer rights. And that is the kind of marketplace logic and language that has come to be used. So although the patient has more say in their treatment, what is overlooked is the importance of trust and interdependence in healthcare relationships. The third shift was one that was very significant and that we're all familiar with, and this was the availability of new forms of health information online. The internet revolutionized the availability of health information. Consider, for example, the rise of websites like WebMD and even just the ability to Google one's symptoms. Patients began to research their symptoms online before visiting their healthcare provider, and they came armed with questions, concerns, and sometimes even an idea of what the diagnosis might be. So this really enabled a shift from the passive, compliant patient to one of active engagement and marked a turning point in healthcare relationships. So the optimistic view of this was that this shift could potentially bridge the gap between the patient and the provider. So, for example, a patient diagnosed with breast cancer in the internet age could use online support groups and informational websites to learn about treatment options. Armed with this knowledge, she could have a more meaningful conversation with her oncologist, asking informed questions and feeling empowered to participate in decisions about her care. In the mid 1990s or early to mid 1990s, during the real rise of the internet, the early days, this emergence of health information online sparked debates that are related to what was called the democratization of health knowledge, the idea that health information could be available to lay people and non-professionals. And the debates concerned the implications for the medical encounter and what it might mean really for the status of healthcare practitioners. So the internet allows people to exchange information about health and illness, including personal accounts. As we mentioned, it allows them to look up information online, to even have an idea of what a diagnosis might be. And there's an uncontrolled mixture, really, of expert and lay knowledge that people can access freely. And this prompted two opposing responses. The first was celebratory, and the second was concerned. The celebratory approach saw the internet as a platform for individuals to equip themselves with information and position themselves as experts, or certainly experts of their own lives, by sharing their experiential knowledge. On the other hand, there were concerns that emerged within the medical field, and critics here argued that easy access to information could undermine trust and reliance on physicians and encourage cyberchondria. Early studies suggested that patients gleaning health information would challenge biomedical understandings with alternative and lay health information. But as time went on, research showed that really the clinical encounter transformed in character, but it wasn't undermined in the way that people thought it might be. Under the influence of the consumer culture of Western societies, individuals were encouraged to act as health consumers who take control of their health and strive for wellness. So this meant that online spaces really just helped them to support this identity of, the health consumer. And research suggests that patients use online information to support their relationship with their physician. They prepare questions to ask their healthcare provider to learn more about what they've been told in the consultation after it's over, but it's certainly not replacing that interaction. And in fact, even when patients do have information that challenges what they've been told in a consultation, they do defer to their doctors. And this suggests that power relationship that's in favor of the healthcare provider still remains. Another important shift is one that we've already discussed right at the beginning of this course, and that is the shift in the nature of health conditions in modern westernized society. And really, we've seen the growth in chronic illness as the main kinds of illnesses and causes of mortality. With long-lasting conditions, patients develop extensive experiential expertise, making the doctor-patient relationship less hierarchical and more of a partnership. So, for example, what I mean is that if we think of a diabetic patient who's been managing her condition for years, she knows what works for her in terms of diet, exercise, and medication, and this might encourage her doctor to take this knowledge into account when adjusting treatment plans rather than just imposing a one-size-fits-all approach. The final shift that I want to talk about is one that, in a sense, can be seen as the culmination of many of the changes that went before, and this is the shift to patient-centeredness. So it's not really a new idea. It started to be proposed in the 1970s, but of course, the social conditions needed to be amenable to what has become known as patient-centered medicine. And patient-centered medicine is really about incorporating patient values, perceptions, and preferences into healthcare encounters. And we look more closely at this patient-centered medicine idea later in the course, and even to more recent developments like the shift from patient-centeredness to person-centeredness. So having looked at the broad societal shifts that have caused changes in the clinical encounter, let's look at different ways of understanding the clinical encounter, or different models. In the 21st century, we now have a range of different models for the clinical encounter as that initial paternalistic model has been challenged and shifted. And today we see a range of models that describe different dynamics in doctor-patient relationships. And it's important to realize that these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, and that they are all possibilities for the way that care might be enacted in contemporary westernized society. So we'll look at 4 that are identified by Dew et al. The first model is the paternalistic model, and this is often used in doctor-patient relationships, and it's particularly common in settings where there is an emphasis on agreeability or less emphasis on individualism and individual rights. So, for example, we often see this in Asian countries, but could also be a model that is more accepted by certain ethnic groups within a Western society. So in this model, the physician is the active decision maker, and the patient's role is passive, limited to information giving when the doctor asks for it, and providing their informed consent. So some patients prefer this model because they simply want to be able to trust the doctor's decision making. And this can be the case with people who are older, if they're very ill, and sometimes if they're less educated and they don't have the confidence to be able to, say, advocate for themselves or access health information, certain kinds of health information. Some doctors prefer this model, and in my research, I found, and which substantiates other international research, that doctors often say that they don't like this model, but they end up enacting this because it gives the doctor the ultimate power to reject shared decision making and to enact a paternalistic approach. And when you are pressed for time, or you have low resources, it's much more efficient to simply just tell people what to do. The next model is the physician as agent model. And this is a variation, I guess, on the traditional paternalistic model. So the patient is given a bit more of an active role, but ultimately the physician is the key decision maker and the guardian of the patient's best interests. So this model recognizes the physician's technical knowledge, but it does admit the patient's own preferences and values. The doctor asks the patients for these and takes them into account when making a treatment decision, and the patient then provides informed consent to this decision. So their role and their power is still a lot less than the doctor's. The third model is the informed patient model, and this is really the flip side of the physician as agent model. So rather than the doctor having the final decision rests with the patient. And this model is heavily informed by medical consumerism. So it's structured around the idea of service provision. So the doctor provides the service in terms of the relevant technical knowledge, and the patient, as the consumer, makes a decision about the course of action that they would like to take. And what is challenging about this model is, although it does give more power to the patient, it is actually a huge responsibility, especially if the person is very ill or vulnerable and hasn't got the capacity necessarily to make sense of expert information. So the final model is the shared decision making model, and this model really tries to rectify some of the problems with the other models. And this is what we would think of as the ideal form of medical decision making in the 21st century in Western contexts. And it involves at least 4 elements. There need to be at least 2 participants to the encounter, but often there can be more. So it's not just the patient and the healthcare provider, but it can be the patient's family or support people. It can involve other professionals like mental health professionals, health psychologists, those sorts of people. And it requires a complex, multi-sided discussion and negotiation among these parties. Secondly, the idea is that the patient participates in decision making along with the healthcare provider. Both parties, thirdly, share information. So the doctor provides the technical information and knowledge, which was the gap, you'll remember, in the previous model of the informed patient model. And then the patient provides their information about their circumstances, what they value, their preferences, their health beliefs, their lived and lay expertise, which we look at in the next section of the course. And then finally, number 4, both parties must agree to the treatment decision, even if they don't see it as ideal. So there's an emphasis on consensus. Unfortunately, empirical evidence suggests that there's not much correlation between patient preferences for shared decision making and actual implementation. In other words, most people say that this is what they would like to have in their healthcare interactions, but it's not actually what they receive. And the reason for this is that there's a lot of barriers to this kind of care, this ideal. The main one being resources. So I've mentioned short consultation times already, but also things like private settings where people can talk confidentially. The kinds of things that would facilitate this sort of interaction. The corporatization of medicine is another barrier. Medical culture, which we've already said, is inherently hierarchical and often paternalistic. And then factors of bias and prejudice, which creep into all human interactions, but also the healthcare encounter, and sometimes without the awareness even of the people involved. So to bring these models alive a little bit and help us to understand them better, including how they might exist side by side in health settings, I want to look at an example. So I'm drawing from my own research done with colleagues here in Aotearoa and in South Africa, where we looked at contraceptive decision making and how both patients and healthcare providers spoke about what those encounters are like. And when we looked at the patients, which were women, we identified 3 common scripts that they spoke about, which really in many ways correspond with these models. So they spoke about the expert-directed script, or scenario, if you want to think about it that way. And this corresponds with the paternalistic and physician as agent models, probably more strongly with the physician as agent, because I think healthcare providers have tried to shift away from paternalism. The second script was what we call the patient-led script, and this corresponds with the informed patient model. And then the final one was the collaborative decision-making script, which corresponds with the shared decision-making script. So each of these provide different scenarios in the counselling session that give power either to providers, to patients, or to both. So it's really about the negotiation, I guess, of roles and power in many ways. Expert-directed script was characterized by the patient deferring to the professional, and this script is supported by a very strong biomedical discourse. So it assumes passive contraceptive users, and if they want to disagree with the doctor, they can only really do that in very subtle ways, covertly usually. So they can agree with the doctor in the consultation and then privately stop contraception, or go to another doctor and ask for their IUD to be taken out, something like that. So the problem with this expert-directed script, we noticed, is that it really supports this top-down interaction on the part of the providers, and meant that they were, in a sense, telling women what they should and shouldn't do. And often this was justified according to gender and racial stereotypes. So the patient-led script, on the other hand, gives the patient more say in decisions. So they have more power in the interaction, and if they want to disagree with the service provider, they can. But the problem is that this script means that patients are responsible for their health. And this gels with that kind of healthist view of the responsible health consumer, as well as the patriarchal positioning of women as being responsible for reproductive health, especially pregnancy prevention. And what we noticed was that it meant that patients were making decisions in instances where they didn't have enough knowledge. So often they would tell stories and say, had I known X, Y, and Z, I would have made a different decision. Or my doctor kind of went along with what I wanted. I told them that I'd like to use the injection. They gave me the pros and cons about that, but they didn't tell me about the IUD, or they didn't tell me about another form of contraceptive. So they were making decisions without all of the information. And if there were any unfavorable outcomes, like contraceptive failure or side effects, then it was on them because they were the ones that had made the decision. And finally, the collaborative decision-making script. As the research shows on the shared decision-making model, this was the most preferred option that people spoke about, but often the least common scenario. So people would talk about how they luckily had a doctor that listened to them and empowered them to, make the decision together, or that it was something they wished they'd had, but they hadn't experienced themselves. And the script envisages decision making as a negotiation between the patient and provider, where the provider's medical knowledge is balanced with the patient's situated knowledge, so knowledge of their own experiences in their own bodies. So our research findings support international research that show the benefits of shared decision-making strategies, which are focused on eliciting information from the patient and responding to their preferences, needs, and values in contraceptive counselling. The findings from our research support international research that show the benefits of shared decision-making strategies focused on eliciting and responding to patient preferences, needs, and values in contraceptive counselling. So obviously this model upholds people's human dignity and rights, but it also has benefits for them in terms of making sure that they stick with a particular method, or that they have a method that fits their lifestyle or their personal circumstances. And our findings align with international findings that indicate that in contraceptive care, shared decision making seems to be an exception rather than a rule, unfortunately. So, both in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in South Africa, this was the least common interaction that people had, as well as the one that was described as an ideal by providers. But when they spoke about their practice, it was clear that this wasn't what was really happening. And really what the research shows, this body of work on patient-centered care, is that there are real benefits to shared decision-making strategies that focus on inviting and responding to what the patient brings to the consultation as well, which we return to later in the course. In this lecture, we've looked at the transformation in the doctor-patient relationship over the last 70 or so years. And we've seen a shift from the doctor knows best model of the hierarchical, paternalistic kind of encounter to one where we increasingly value patient autonomy and collaboration. And as we continue to embrace models like shared decision-making and patient-centered care, even person-centered care, the healthcare encounter becomes less about authority and more about partnership, where the patient's voice is central to care. So in closing, I ask two questions for you to ponder on. First, what barriers still exist in ensuring equitable healthcare encounters? And second, how might the shift to shared decision-making impact the experiences of patients from marginalized groups?